this was the first time that we were invoking the Emergencies Act, that we went to great pains to get it right. And in retrospect, I do think that the entire episode and the saga does expose a number of questions.
The Minister of Public Safety faced questions at a special joint committee reviewing the use of the Emergencies Act, but that's not the only forum required to look into its unprecedented use. It's also being challenged in court, and this week the Prime Minister announced an independent public inquiry, leaving the opposition to question how far it would go.
The Prime Minister invoked the Emergency Measures Act on Canadians without justification, and now he's trying to hide it. His ministers admitted they won't be cooperating with the inquiry, and they'll be hiding behind cabinet confidence.
This is all happening as Ottawa braces for more protests this weekend, led by at least some of the organizers who have ties to the so-called Freedom Convoy. So how much transparency can we expect from these reviews? It's Thursday. I'm here with That Issue. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Good to see everybody. So the public inquiry was announced on the last day the government could do so before its set deadline. And the justice named, Justice Paul Rouleau, is tasked with investigating, it seems, every aspect of the truckers' behavior. Chantal, maybe I'll start with you. What do you make of sort of the focus and the scope of the inquiry and what rules he's been given to look at?
What I make of it is what the law says, and I'm sure that Justice Rouleau can read the law and its purpose as the law prescribes. This is not some great gesture of openness on the part of the Liberal government. It is what the law says they have to do, is to validate or not, find whether the circumstances warranted the use of the act or not. Mm-hmm. That does involve looking at context, who the people were, what was happening. I'm not sure that the government has an open and shut case on this, but I think a lot of the coverage this week is focused on the terms of reference that the government put on the commission. But at the end of the day, the judge in charge of this is bound to be guided by the actual law that says that he must answer that fundamental question. Was the government right, or did it overreach by doing this?
Andrew?
Yeah, I think those terms of reference were an elaborate effort at misdirection to get everybody focused on what were the truckers doing, what kind of problem did they represent, which are legitimate questions. But as Chantal says, at the end of the day, the really critical question that the judge should be addressing and is required by law to address is what was the measures that were in fact enacted, were they justified or not? I don't think there was any doubt that there was a serious emergency on our hands. The situation in Ottawa in particular was intolerable and showed no signs of ending. Yep. Whether the Emergencies Act was responsible or not, it seems interesting that as soon as it was brought in, the police seemed to act with an alacrity that they hadn't before, and the protest was shut down. And it seemed to be done so at rather minimal cost to civil liberties. But there is this crucial question of necessity. If you're going to bring in any kind of law like that, you have to show, there has to be the necessity, you have to show the necessity. It's always incumbent upon the government to show that. It signaling has not done so to date. It may be able to do so in the course of this inquiry, and that is certainly what the inquiry is part of its mandate. I will say, I think it's also important to know, how did we get into this fix? Not just what were the truckers up to, but why didn't the police act sooner? Everyone says, well, the police had all the powers they needed, and therefore the Emergencies Act was not necessary. And yet the police didn't use those powers, and or certainly it appeared didn't use those powers. And I think that is an important question that the inquiry should address, so that we don't get into this fix again.
Althia?
So the government actually wasn't obliged to appoint a public inquiry. Some of the advice that Cabinet had received basically said that they have to appoint somebody to do an inquiry, but it doesn't need to be public. So I think they deserve, I don't know, congratulations is a bit too strong, but we should all be thankful.
Some credit,
that they went with a public inquiry, because it is unprecedented that the government does this, and you do want to set the bar so that if it happens again, that this is the way things are done. I think a few things might have changed. The NDP Liberal arrangement gives them 3 years. So if anything, there is ample time to recuperate from the fallout of the inquiry if that's required. And judging by the criteria of the inquiry, and Andrew alluded to this, the Liberals really want to make this a public display of how the Conservatives have supported, some Conservatives, not all, but many Conservative MPs have supported lawlessness on the streets of Ottawa. And they're hoping that that is going to come out in the forefront during this public inquiry. I think that, a few things struck me this week on the whole whether or not the commission is going to have access to secret documents. I think it would be completely incomprehensible if it did not. I think that the minister is trying to shift the blame a little bit on the public servants. I'm not sure if that's the RCMP or CSIS, but they keep coming back about this was the advice that we were given. That's something that has been repeated ad nauseum, but also they are really trying to make the case that they had no choice but to do this. And the threshold they do have to meet is whether or not there were any other laws that they could have used. And Marco Mendicino is really, I don't want to say exaggerating the claims, but really emphasizing the problems that they were facing, cranes in front of the Prime Minister's office. And I worry in the concern of disinformation fueling this movement, if the government's overemphasizing certain aspects of this, whether or not really it was a siege in Ottawa, whether they really did want to overthrow the government, might actually hurt them rather than help.
Elamin?
There's been much consternation about the idea that, the letter itself doesn't spell out whether the inquiry has to answer whether the government has met that threshold or not. But as Chantal has pointed out, that is a bit of a tautology, right? Like, that's sort of the purpose of the whole inquiry. And it's just going to be a part of what that inquiry answers. To me, I think the bigger signal is the fact that they waited this long. They waited until the very last day possible to make this inquiry call. I think that presents the image, whether the Liberals like it or not, that they were hoping that this would sort of slide into the back burner in terms of stories, so people would not be paying attention to this particular story. I think by waiting until that long, they sort of ring some alarm bells for people, or at least like trigger the people who already thought that they have something to hide. Their case is sort of strengthened by the fact that they waited this long. They could have called this on day 2. The fact that they waited this long, I think, does not probably reflect on them this well. Having said that, we keep coming back to the agreement that they struck with the NDP that sort of protects them from any sort of long-term harm. We are really recovering in this panel, but also just in general in politics in this country, from existing in minority government mode for 3 years and fearing that any kind of big discussion could trigger an election. We are not in that landscape anymore, and the Liberals kind of know it, so they feel like they can take their time.
Chantal?
Okay, let's recall that this is a government that months in still has to appoint an ambassador to France or an ambassador to China. So if they were students, they would be the people who ask for an extension to deliver their essay.
They like a deadline,
And that's been a pattern forever.
Yeah.
I do believe they would like to shift the blame onto the Conservatives. And I do believe the Conservatives would like the inquiry to show that this was an overreach. I'm not convinced that a year from now, either side will suffer from whatever conclusions come from this.
Right.
And that is not to diminish how important it is to go through the process.
Yes.
But I don't think that many Canadians are waking up at night saying the Conservatives did this or the Liberals should not have done that. Especially since in the end it cleared the blockade. But I will argue that their case is weaker because the Windsor-Detroit blockade got resolved without this.
Sure.
And Parliament Hill functioned despite the blockade, which doesn't help their case.
Andrew,
this government has shown a talent for taking issues that might have been manageable and not that big, and making them larger issues because of their consistent refusal to come clean and to produce documents. For example, with the the Winnipeg laboratory, the decommissioning of those 2 scientists, for example, with S&C Lavalin, that was a fairly big letter to begin with, but they compounded it by their stonewalling of committees, refusal to yield witnesses and documents, et cetera. So Althia is right that it's good that it's a public inquiry, but we'll see how public it is by whether or not the government is willing to release the documents. And so far, both in terms of its prior issues and in terms of its initial statements on this inquiry, I don't think we have a lot of confidence that when push comes to shove, they're going to be willing to release documents that might prove embarrassing to the government on this regard. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But that would certainly make this an issue not just of what they did or did not do in the course of this Emergencies Act, but this more broader question of accountability and whether or not the government can be held to account for its decisions. 20
seconds to you, Althia and Elamin.
I would say the question about the documents is a really interesting one because it speaks to the lack of trust that is on Parliament Hill. It is quite likely that Justice Rouleau will get secret documents that the government will be refusing to give to the committee that is supposed to be overseeing this, because the Conservatives basically do not want to have access to documents that they cannot speak about publicly.
Yep.
And that is really the crux of the problem. And if you'll recall back when we had the Afghan detainees, the solution at the time with the Harper government was to create this committee. Everybody was sworn in and they couldn't talk about what had happened. And the Conservatives do not want to partake in activities like that again.
No, and that created problems for reporters and for Canadians to not understand what happened. Elamin?
I think I would just end by saying, look, this kind of inquiry and what it produces is exactly the kind of story where, political parties are sort of maybe eager to use its results to clobber the other parties with. But it's exactly the kind of inquiry that could end up backfiring on each party that desires to do that. I think we're pretty early on in this process, but we'll see what comes of it.
When will this Prime Minister understand that delay on climate action has the same outcomes of denial of the climate crisis?
We have strengthened our benchmark and standards, addressing many of the issues the Commissioner identified, and we will continue to hold provinces and territories' feet to the fire to meet these new targets.
That exchange came in response to the Environment Commissioner's report this week, which warned that Canada's 2030 emissions targets may not be achievable. Also this week, we saw at least 2 Conservative leadership candidates, Pierre Poilievre and Jean Charest, release new climate policy proposals. Chantal, Andrew, Althia, and Elamin back for one other quick round of At Issue. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of this, but maybe, Elamin, I'll start with you about the report itself and some of the red flags raised by the Commissioner. Not to say, you're not doing anything, but certainly to say some of the things that you're relying on may not happen and may not get you where you want to go.
Yeah, I think Commissioner DeMarco's report was damning to the Liberals in a few ways. I think after they rolled out we all sort of saw that big rollout of the plan, and the plan was sort of meant to bolster the government's credibility. So to have this blow to the credibility in terms of saying this actually will not be able to get you to the target that you're trying to reach, I think is a significant blow to them. But also, I want to highlight some of the specific things that were in that report. Like, for example, the report mentioned that the government is relying a little bit too much on Indigenous people and small businesses and not enough on the sort of big emitters. I think that's a really significant finding from the Commissioner, and I think that's something that the NDP will sort of use to their advantage the next few weeks, I imagine.
For sure. Althia.
That was on the carbon price. Put that in at that context. To me, I think there were 2 things that struck out in the report. The findings on hydrogen, basically the government is overestimating the savings that it will find on that, and the just transition, that it hasn't planned adequately for it. And I think this speaks to 2 vulnerabilities. One, we saw in this budget $6 billion as a tax credit for the carbon capture, utilization, and storage tax credit, which is seen as a fossil fuel subsidy, but also our way to get to net zero. And if basically Ottawa is saying that the Commissioner is saying that Ottawa is overestimating the savings it could have, this does not bode well for the future. And the just transition has been something the Liberals have fallen back to say, all these oil and gas workers out west, they will not be hard done by. They will transition to new green jobs that will pay more, and they will not fall into this trap where they are stuck in an EI system, and that's inadequate. And the government is basically has shown that it doesn't have a plan for them, and that's another knock against the Liberals. So I think it is People have discovered during the pandemic that government can do big things. And this is a big thing the government wants done and doesn't seem to have devoted the resources to it.
And it's interesting, Andrew, because it's contrasting with some of the Conservative leadership candidates, as I said, saying they're going to scrap the individual carbon tax, they're going to build pipelines everywhere. I mean, you can sort of see this debate shaping up again, and then the potential criticism that they could make of the Liberals.
Yeah, well, what you see here is deep all-party unseriousness on this issue. I don't say they're equally unserious. I think the Conservatives have much more to answer than the Liberals on this. But the Liberals, this government has a tendency to mistake the wish for the deed. They want to be congratulated for all their good intentions and not held to account for whether they actually deliver on them. But a target is not a plan, and a plan is only as good as as the actions that follow. And what we see in that Environment Commissioner's report is a consistent failure to follow through on that. In part, that's because for all their talk of carbon pricing, it only accounts for about 1/3 of the emissions they're reducing. The rest of it is these highly detailed regulations and subsidy schemes that are hard to do in themselves and inferior in themselves, but require a high degree of managerial competence to achieve. And managerial competence is not the strong suit of this government. But as I say, if you then look at the Conservatives, they're not even bothering to lay out the plans. They want to scrap the tax. John Sherrod wants to keep it for industrial polluters, but not for the consumer side, which means A, you're not actually covering or a good chunk of the economy by doing that, and B, you're pretending that the costs you impose on those big polluters aren't going to be passed through to consumers.
Right.
What again is common to all these parties is they want to get to there without to the emissions reductions without actually imposing costs that are visible to consumers. And the only way you get to this is by imposing costs that are visible to consumers, because that's when they take the actions that are necessary to avoid them.
That's when they change behavior. Last word to you, Chantal.
But it cuts both ways. All parties, and I'll include the NDP and the Bloc Québécois in there, do not want to tell people that there is a cost to doing this. And that it will involve changes, big changes, and probably some costs. And on the other hand, consumers do not want to be told that. And until the two meet, we are not going to have an effective climate change policy.
Okay, well, on that depressing note, I'll thank you all for your analysis, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.